Dean Martin stopped mid-song. His eyes locked on the empty chair in the front row. He lowered the microphone slowly. That chair had never been empty. Not in 30 years. The Copa Room. The Sands Hotel. Las Vegas. February 1972. The room held 300 people in tuxedos and evening gowns. Candlelight flickered on white tablecloths. Cigarette smoke drifted through amber stage lights. The orchestra sat ready behind Dean. 17 musicians in matching dark suits, frank military at the conductor's stand, waiting for the downbeat. This was Dean Martin's kingdom. The place where he reigned without effort, without trying, without breaking a sweat. He'd walk on stage with a tumbler of what everyone assumed was whiskey, though it was usually apple juice, and make it look like the easiest thing in the world to hold 300 people in the palm of his hand. Tonight was supposed to be like every other night. 2 shows. Sold out. High rollers at the front tables. Tourists in the back. The usual Rat Pack crowd scattered throughout, friends, hangers-on, Vegas regulars who'd seen Dean perform 1,000 times and would see him 1,000 more. Dean opened with, "Ain't that a kick in the head?" The audience laughed at his timing, applauded at the right moments, settled into the familiar rhythm of a Dean Martin show. Then he moved into "Everybody Loves Somebody," his signature song. The one that had knocked the Beatles off the top of the charts in 1964. The crowd always loved this one. Dean stood at the microphone, singing the opening verse with that effortless baritone, when his eyes drifted, as they always did, to the front row. Front row, second table from the left. The seat that had been reserved every single night Dean performed at the Copa Room since 1942. The seat was empty. Dean's voice caught. Just for a second. A micro-hesitation that most of the audience missed. But the orchestra noticed. Frank Military's baton faltered slightly. The piano player glanced up from his keys. Dean kept singing, but something had shifted. The easy smile was still there, but it no longer reached his eyes. He finished the song. The audience applauded. Dean nodded, took a sip from his glass, and moved into his planned patter, the jokes between songs that made his shows feel like hanging out with your funniest friend. But his eyes kept drifting back to that empty chair. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room understood anyway. The man who should have been sitting in that chair was named Anthony Benedetti, though everyone who knew him called him Tony the Smile. Tony wasn't famous. He'd never been on television, never recorded an album, never had his name in lights. He was a Copa Room waiter. Had been since the room opened in 1942. 30 years of carrying drinks, clearing tables, making sure the high rollers felt like kings and the tourists felt like high rollers. But Tony wasn't just any waiter. He was Dean's waiter. And more importantly, he was Dean's friend. They'd met in 1942, when Dean Martin was still Dino Crocetti, a nobody singer trying to make it in New York before the war. Dean had gotten his first real gig, 2 weeks at the Copa Room, opening for a magician whose name nobody remembered anymore. Dean was 25 years old. Scared. Broke. Wearing a borrowed tuxedo that didn't quite fit. Tony was 30. A waiter with a face that looked like he just heard the world's best joke and was dying to share it. That's why they called him Tony the Smile. On Dean's first night he'd bombed. Not completely. He'd gotten through his set, but the applause had been polite at best. Dean had walked off stage convinced his career was over before it started. Tony had been waiting in the wings with a glass of water. "First time?" Tony had asked. "That obvious? You held the microphone like it was gonna bite you." Tony handed him the water. "Also, you forgot to smile. Didn't feel like smiling. Kid, you're in show business. Half of it is feeling. The other half is making 'em think you're feeling it even when you're not." Tony had clapped him on the shoulder. "Tomorrow night you smile. Even if you're dying inside. Especially if you're dying inside. That's the job." Dean had taken that advice. The next night he smiled. He loosened up. He stopped trying so hard. And something clicked. After the show, Tony had reserved that front row seat. "I'm gonna sit here every night you perform," he'd said. "And when you're about to forget to smile, you look at me. I'll remind you." For 30 years, Tony kept that promise. Through Dean's early struggles. Through his partnership with Jerry Lewis that made them both stars. Through the painful split in 1956 that everyone said would end Dean's career. Through Dean's solo success that proved them all wrong. Through the Rat Pack years with Frank and Sammy. Through the movies, the TV show, the Vegas residencies. Tony was always there. Front row, second table from the left. Smiling. When Dean was tired, he'd look at Tony. When a joke didn't land, he'd look at Tony. When the room felt cold, or the audience felt distant, or the weight of being the king of cool felt too heavy, he'd look at Tony. And Tony would smile that smile. The one that said, "You got this, kid." Just like always. Until tonight. February 12, 1972. When the chair was empty. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dean finished his third song. The audience was warm now, laughing at his jokes, leaning forward when he sang the ballads. A perfect Copa Room crowd. But Dean couldn't stop looking at that empty chair. During the instrumental break, Dean stepped back from the microphone. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, the white silk one he always carried, and dabbed his forehead. It was a move the audience had seen 1,000 times. Part of the act. But this time, Dean held the handkerchief a second too long. His hand trembled slightly as he folded it and returned it to his pocket. Frank Military noticed. He'd been Dean's musical director for 15 years. He could read Dean's mood in the space between notes. Something was wrong. The orchestra finished the instrumental. Dean stepped back to the microphone for the final verse of "You're nobody till somebody loves you." He opened his mouth. The words wouldn't come. Dean stood there, microphone in hand, the orchestra waiting, the audience waiting, 300 people holding their collective breath because Dean Martin, the smoothest man in show business, had just frozen on stage. 5 seconds of silence. An eternity in a live performance. Then Dean did something he'd never done in 30 years of performing at the Copa Room. He lowered the microphone. Slowly. Deliberately. Until it hung at his side. The orchestra stopped playing. The ambient noise of clinking glasses and quiet conversation died. The entire room went silent. Dean looked directly at that empty chair. "Tony," he said quietly. His voice barely carried past the first few rows, but in that silence, everyone heard him. "Tony the smile. He's supposed to be sitting right there." He pointed to the empty chair. 300 heads turned to look. 30 years, Dean continued, his voice still quiet but steady. "Every single night I've performed in this room, Tony's been in that chair. He's the guy who taught me to smile even when I didn't feel like it. He's the guy who made me believe I belonged on this stage." Dean paused. Swallowed hard. The cool facade was cracking, but he didn't try to hide it. He died this morning. Heart attack. 62 years old. Was carrying a tray of drinks when it happened. Went quick, they said. Didn't suffer. The room was frozen. Frank Military had tears on his face. The waiters who'd known Tony, many of them for decades, stood against the walls with their hands over their mouths. "His daughter called me this afternoon," Dean said. "Asked if I'd say something tonight." Asked if I'd? His voice broke. For the first time in 3 decades of performing, Dean Martin couldn't maintain control. She asked if I'd save his chair? Just for tonight. So he could be here one more time. Dean looked at the empty chair. At the reserve sign on the table. At the untouched glass of water Tony's fellow waiters had placed there as a tribute. "So I'm gonna do something I've never done before," Dean said. "I'm gonna finish this song without looking at Tony's chair. Because if I look at it again, I'm not gonna make it through." He raised the microphone. Nodded to Frank Military. The orchestra came back in softly, gently, giving Dean the space to find his voice again. And Dean sang the final verse of "You're Nobody Till Somebody Loves You." But his eyes stayed on the back wall, never once drifting to that front row. Backstage, Dean made a choice no one expected, because it wasn't for the cameras. The show ended 90 minutes later. Dean took his bows. The audience gave him a standing ovation, not the usual enthusiastic applause, but something quieter, more reverent. They understood they'd witnessed something rare, Dean Martin being human instead of cool. Backstage, Dean's manager was waiting. "That was beautiful, Dean. Really moving. We should tell the press. This could be a great—" "No," Dean cut him off. His voice was flat, final. "Tony wasn't a publicity opportunity. This doesn't leave the room." "But Dean—" I said no. Dean walked past him to his dressing room. Inside, sitting on his makeup table, was a small envelope. His name written in shaky handwriting. He opened it. Inside was a photograph, faded, creased, 30 years old. It showed a young Dean Martin and Tony the Smile standing backstage at the Copa Room, arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera. Dean barely remembered the photo being taken. On the back, in fresh ink, was a note from Tony's daughter. "Dad wanted you to have this. He said it was from the night you finally figured out how to smile. He kept it in his wallet every day for 30 years. Thank you for being his friend. Thank you for remembering him tonight. Maria." Dean sat down heavily in his chair. He looked at the photograph for a long time. At the young man he'd been. At the friend who'd helped him become who he was. Then he did something he almost never did. He cried. Not the controlled, camera-ready tears of a performer. The real, ugly, painful tears of a man who'd lost someone irreplaceable. There was a knock on the door. Frank Military stuck his head in. "You okay, Pally?" Dean wiped his eyes with that white silk handkerchief. "No. But I will be. The band wants to know. Do you want us to keep that chair reserved? For future shows?" Dean looked at the photograph again. At Tony's smile. At that moment 30 years ago, when everything had started. "Yeah," Dean said. "Keep it reserved. Every show. Forever." But what happened next was the part nobody, not even the band, saw coming. The next night Dean performed again. The Copa Room was sold out. High rollers, tourists, celebrities, the usual crowd. Front row, second table from the left, the chair was reserved. Empty. A small card on the table read, "Reserved for Tony the Smile." Dean walked on stage. Started his opening number. His eyes drifted to the empty chair. And he smiled. Not the cool, effortless Dean Martin smile. Something else. Something real. Because he realized Tony had kept his promise. Even in death, he was still there. Still reminding Dean to smile. Still teaching him the job. Dean performed that night like he never performed before. Not trying to be cool. Not hiding behind the tumbler and the easy charm. Just being present. Being real. Being the man Tony had taught him to be. The audience didn't know why the performance felt different. But they felt it. After the show, Dean went to that empty chair. He placed the photograph from Tony's daughter on the table. Left it there for the waitstaff to find. On the back, he'd added his own note below Maria's. "You taught me how to smile, Tony. Now teach these kids." Dean. The photograph stayed in the Copa Room for the next decade, framed and mounted on the wall near the bar. Every waiter who worked there learned Tony's story. Many of them said they could feel him watching, making sure they took care of the customers the way he had. Dean kept that chair reserved until his final performance at the Copa Room in 1982. 10 years of empty seats. 10 years of remembering to smile. When the Sands was demolished in 1996, the photograph was rescued from the rubble. Maria gave it to the Smithsonian along with Dean's white silk handkerchief, the one he'd used to wipe his eyes that night. They sit together in the collection. A reminder that the coolest man in show business was cool because someone taught him how to be human first. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Tony the Smile died in 1972. But every night Dean performed after that, he'd look at that empty chair, smile, and remember, half of it is feeling, and the other half is making them think you're feeling it. Tony taught him both.